The immigration office sat just off the main terminal, sealed behind thick glass like a room meant for conversations people didn't want overheard. The noise of the airport died the moment the door shut behind me. No boarding calls, no rolling suitcases, just the low electrical hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of footsteps passing outside, lives continuing while mine stalled. The supervisor didn't sit down. He stood near the desk, shoulders squared but stiff, as if he hadn't decided yet whether this conversation required authority or caution. My passport rested in his left hand. In his right, a thin gray file, edges bent, corners softened by age. His thumb rubbed the spine of it again and again, a small, involuntary motion that didn't match his calm expression. He closed the file slowly, too slowly. The sound landed heavier than it should have. "Before we let you board," he said, voice lowered, almost careful, "I need to confirm something that could invalidate your entire travel record." He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes stayed on the desk, on a single spot worn smooth by years of paperwork. I noticed then that his knuckles had gone pale, grip tightening around the file as if it might argue back. The door behind me clicked when he turned the lock. Not dramatic, just procedural. Still, the sound registered. Locked doors always do. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my passport. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers still, because panic shows fastest in small movements. My chest tightened, not sharply, but in that slow, spreading way that makes you aware of every breath you take. He added nothing, no explanation, no question yet. Just that one sentence hanging between us, heavy with implications he hadn't named. The hum of the light stretched, warped, and pulled me backward before I realized my mind had already left the room. I was 16 the first time I learned how quickly an airport can decide you don't belong. Same smell of disinfectant and burnt coffee, same polished floors reflecting overhead lights. Different terminal, smaller body. I remember gripping the strap of my backpack so tightly my fingers went numb, knuckles white against faded fabric. A one-way ticket sat folded in my pocket, creased from how many times I checked it, like rereading the destination might change what it meant. My family stood just beyond the security line, close enough to hear, far enough not to intervene. Their voices stayed low but sharp, the way people speak when they've already made up their minds. "She's old enough. We've done what we can." Then a uniformed officer stepped into my space, polite, detached, and asked me to come with him. My boarding pass was taken from my hand, folded once, and slid into a pocket that wasn't mine. No one argued. No one asked questions. The last thing I heard before the doors slid shut was, "She's not our responsibility anymore." Back in the immigration office, the supervisor shifted his stance. The file was open again now, angled slightly away from me, but I could see enough. A yellowed tab, a date printed in thin black ink, older than most of the records they dealt with daily. His pen hovered above the page, then tapped once, twice, stopping abruptly like he'd caught himself reacting. That wasn't confusion, that was recognition. "This isn't about anything recent," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "It's about an incident logged when you were a minor." The word minor settled deep, connecting itself to places in my memory I hadn't touched in years. I nodded once, slowly, inviting him to continue without giving him anything back emotionally. "I've traveled internationally for years," I said evenly. "Work visas, conferences, nothing ever flagged." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Some records don't surface unless certain conditions are met, and today they were. I leaned back slightly in the chair, crossing my ankles, keeping my posture relaxed even as my pulse picked up. Stillness had become a habit over time. Silence makes people fill gaps with the truth. "What exactly is being questioned?" I asked. He inhaled, then exhaled through his nose, a controlled release that told me this wasn't routine. "Your classification of your removal," he said, "specifically who carried legal responsibility for it." A memory surfaced without warning, a counselor years later sliding a manila folder across a desk and saying, "Keep everything. Copies matter. People forget conversations. Paper doesn't." I listened. I saved forms, letters, dates scribbled in margins, not out of bitterness, but because I needed proof that what happened to me wasn't imaginary. Am I being denied boarding? I asked calmly. Not yet, he said, but if this classification stands, it could affect future visas, reentry privileges, even how your identity record is tagged across systems. There it was, not spelled out, just enough. I let the weight of it sit between us, noticed the way his fingers tightened again around the file. I was 16, I said quietly. I didn't sign anything. His eyes flicked up then, just for a moment, and something unreadable passed through them. The system doesn't always record intent, he replied, only outcomes. He turned the file slightly, revealing the header of a document inside, official letterhead, language dense and precise. My gaze caught on one phrase before he shifted it away. Voluntary release. Not here, I thought. I didn't volunteer, I said, voice steady, factual. I understand, he said, and this time I believed him, but understanding and documentation aren't the same thing. Outside the glass, a family laughed near a gate, a kid tugging at his mother's sleeve, impatient to move. The contrast felt surreal, like watching someone else's life on mute. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I was alert. Then let's document it properly, on record. The pen in his hand stilled. For the first time, he looked at me fully, like he was recalibrating an assumption he'd brought into the room. He flipped to the marked page, slower now, and I caught the date clearly. The day I was pulled from the line, the day responsibility changed hands without my consent. That file, I realized, as his pen hovered over the margin, was never about travel. It was about who the system decided could be left behind. By the time I understood what had actually happened, nothing dramatic had occurred. No shouting, no confrontation, no raised voices echoing through a hallway. No door slammed hard enough to mark the moment as permanent. What stayed with me wasn't noise, it was paper. That's the part people rarely understand. Loss doesn't always arrive as rejection. Sometimes it arrives formatted, clean, and official. Not as rejection, as logistics. The letter didn't say I was denied. It didn't say I was unwanted or unqualified. It said my file had been adjusted. Another form used the phrase placed temporarily. A clerk with a practiced voice explained it would be faster, easier. No one sounded cruel. No one sounded angry. They sounded efficient, like they were helping me move through something minor. And that's how it started. Systems don't panic, they document. Every visit added a line. Every missing signature became a note. Every note became a flag. It doesn't sort itself out. It stacks. At the time, I still believed errors wanted to be found. I believed that if something was wrong, it would surface naturally, like a loose thread begging to be pulled. I didn't understand that systems don't feel discomfort when something doesn't make sense. They wait. The first cost showed up quietly, almost politely. My college application didn't reject me, it stalled. The portal stayed gray, no green check, no red X, just pending verification. Weeks passed, deadlines closed. Counselors shrugged with sympathetic half-smiles. Sometimes it takes longer, one of them said, as if time itself would correct what process refused to touch. When I finally called, the woman on the phone paused longer than she should have. I could hear typing stop. "There's a discrepancy," she said. Discrepancy sounded small, like a typo, like something clerical. Nothing moved after that. The second cost was financial. At the bank, the clerk scanned my ID twice. Her smile tightened in a way that wasn't hostile, just cautious. "Can you confirm this information?" she asked, turning the screen slightly away from me. I confirmed everything: name, date, history. She nodded, typed, then stopped. "I'll need to escalate this." That word again, escalate. I didn't get an account that day. I didn't get an explanation either. The third cost was time itself. Job applications that stayed open but never progressed. Background checks that never cleared but never failed. I wasn't being accused of anything. I was being slowed. And slowing someone down doesn't require justification, just documentation. By the third time, I understood the pattern. Every system saw the same shadow. Not a crime, not an allegation, a A pause, a note, a flag, something that suggested risk without ever naming it. That's when Miss Alvarez noticed. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't lower her voice or lean in like she was sharing a secret. She just said, "Systems respect paper more than memory." She laid the trail out for me. Notes referencing notes, flags referencing flags, none of them false on their own, none of them complete either. Together they formed something solid enough to block progress, but light enough that no single person felt responsible. One record read, "We did our best." Another said, "It was complicated." Polite sentences, self-protective language. My family spoke the same way, careful, vague, finished with the past. No one denied anything. No one admitted anything either. And that's when it became clear. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Systems reveal themselves when you don't interrupt them. I stopped asking emotionally framed questions. I stopped explaining myself like I needed permission to exist. Instead, I watched. Every time I stayed quiet, the system spoke. Every delay revealed where authority actually lived. Every form showed who process was designed to protect. I wasn't unreliable, the system was. By the time adulthood arrived, the structure was already set, not because of one decision, but because of accumulated permission. Permission to delay, permission to defer, permission to label someone complex instead of accountable. No villain, no courtroom yet, just a system that remembered everything and forgave nothing. And that was the foundation. Not for anger, not for revenge, for record. Because systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to evidence. The airport terminal hummed around me, a background murmur of rolling luggage and distant boarding calls blending into a low, mechanical drone. I stayed seated at the polished metal bench in the private immigration office, arms folded lightly over a thin folder containing my travel documents, my eyes calm, scanning the muted activity outside the glass walls. The supervisor across the desk hadn't returned my gaze since I arrived. His hands trembled just slightly as they hovered over the closed file, the faintest shake betraying the rigidity of his calm voice. "We'll need to verify your minor status history before we can proceed," he said again, each word slow, deliberate, the implication immediate. My past could legally invalidate my present. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my passport. Instead, I let the pause linger, letting the fluorescent lights hum and the air conditioning whispers fill the silence, just as they did 16 years ago. I thought of that day, of the same terminal but under a different guise. 16, alone, a boarding pass ripped from my hands, and the escort that had led me down the cold linoleum corridor. The echo of "she's not our responsibility anymore" had followed me into adulthood. That sentence was not just words, it had been a procedural decree disguised as indifference, and I had carried it quietly, filing each fragment of humiliation into a mental ledger I had only recently begun to audit. Systems do not panic. Systems document. That was the first rule I had learned. I requested the internal report from the airline legal compliance office, my tone calm, my expression neutral. No pleading, no raised voice, only a precise articulation of what I needed. Every incident report, every minor abandonment classification, every signed document connected to my travel record. The young clerk slid the folder across the desk, their fingers brushing mine, eyes briefly meeting mine before darting away. I noted the timestamp on each digital file, the exact font used, the scanned signatures that were not my own but bore my name. My adult travel record had been built atop a foundation that was legally corrupted, orchestrated by my own family's strategic avoidance of responsibility. A chain of micro-twists revealed itself as I studied the reports. Weeks after the airport incident, my guardian had filed a voluntary separation form, a paper that had never been presented to me. My signature appeared forged or substituted on multiple documents, giving the impression that I had consented to what had effectively been a release into administrative limbo. The airline system, methodical and unfeeling, had flagged me as a released minor, transferring all legal liability away from the adults who had abandoned me, quietly sheltering themselves behind bureaucracy while I bore the consequences. I traced every layer of deception with a methodical precision I had honed over years, cross-referencing file numbers, noting inconsistencies in timestamps, scanning for missing endorsements. Each micro-twist built upon the previous, subtle yet undeniable. Hidden administrative fees shifted into my account, a fake identity registration nearly preventing me from opening a bank account at 18, college applications delayed because a legal waiver had never been corrected. Everything was documented. Everything had a footprint if one knew where to look. That's when Miss Cooper entered the frame, the aviation ombudsman who had agreed to review my case. Her presence was quiet, grounded, authoritative, yet unassuming. She leaned forward, tapping a folder that contained copies of my corrected legal waivers, her calm voice emphasizing, "This shouldn't have been allowed to stand. Systems are designed to protect, but here they were manipulated, carefully, patiently." Her assessment was clinical, precise, echoing the silent mantra I had followed all these years: patience, observation, documentation. No emotion could compete with evidence, and Miss Cooper understood that. I didn't confront my family. I didn't call out their past deception. Instead, I allowed the files, the reports, and the signatures to speak. Every letter, every timestamp was a micro-reveal. The voluntary release form quietly signed weeks after my real abandonment, the forged consents hidden among official records, the minor's liability officially transferred. Each revelation was small, yet together they formed a chain so tightly wound that any attempt at refutation would crumble. My guardian's previous justifications, "We did what we could, it was complicated," could not override this systematic proof. In the quiet of the office, as fluorescent lights cast a neutral glow over spreadsheets and digital documents, I realized the true scope of what had happened. They hadn't merely abandoned me, they had leveraged bureaucracy to shield themselves from consequence, expecting the system to carry out their quiet erasure. My adult self understood the elegance of that deception, the way it relied on my compliance and silence. I had been documented, processed, and misplaced, all without anyone raising a hand. And now, with the same system open before me, I had the power to redirect that narrative. Minutes stretched. Time, which had always seemed elastic, now felt compressed, each tick of the digital clock marking progress in my methodical audit. I requested further disclosure, internal memos, email correspondence, time-stamped calls. Every micro-twist added another layer: a forgotten hotel record that contradicted my guardian's claims, a misfiled travel itinerary that could have jeopardized my passport eligibility, subtle financial manipulations that quietly shifted liabilities in their favor. The chain was undeniable, precise, and entirely recoverable. A small smile crossed my face, not of triumph, but of recognition. The system that had once failed me could now be leveraged in my favor. I knew which signatures were forged, which waivers were misapplied, and which records carried legal weight. The airport clerk and Miss Cooper were merely conduits. The truth resided in the paper trail, as it always had. I quietly highlighted each discrepancy, making notes that would feed directly into the formal review process later, every annotation deliberate, every observation recorded without bias or emotional flourish. I took a breath and looked out at the terminal again. Travelers bustled past, oblivious to the unfolding legal recalibration behind these glass walls. My presence here was calm, controlled, purposeful. No shouting, no pleas, just the patient gathering of facts, letting systems reveal themselves when unperturbed by human drama. Each small twist, every forged signature, misfiled document, subtle financial shift was now visible, ready to be presented in a logical and irrefutable sequence. By the time I left the office, I carried more than just a folder. I carried clarity. I knew that when the formal hearing arrived, every micro-twist would converge, showing that they hadn't just failed me, they had strategically exploited the system to avoid consequence. And in that convergence, my future would be fully restored. I had not screamed, I had not begged, I had watched, noted, and waited. The system itself, patient and precise, would now correct what they had attempted to obscure. I walked into the small conference room at the airport legal office, the hum of the ventilation system punctuating the silence. The fluorescent lights bounced off the polished table, reflecting the stark white of stacked folders and time-stamped files that were now my shield. Mr. Whitman, the airline legal counsel, looked up briefly, his pen tapping nervously against the edge of a file. I didn't flinch. I had been building this quiet storm for years, and now the papers were louder than any shouting could ever be. "Before we proceed," he said, voice low but firm, "you understand the implications of the documents we'll review today." "I do," I replied evenly. My eyes were fixed on the first folder, a stack of airline reports, minor abandonment forms, and liability waivers bearing signatures that weren't mine, or at least not mine as I remembered signing them. Each sheet had a timestamp, an initial, a digital trail. Every forged signature and misfiled waiver was a breadcrumb leading back to the adults who thought they'd protected themselves. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. A projector hummed, ready to display scanned forms. I passed the folder to the compliance officer, Miss Ramirez, a woman who had quietly become my ally. She handled every sheet with meticulous care, her brow furrowed, lips pressed into a straight line, a professional mask that hid her shock. "This shouldn't have been allowed to stand," she said quietly, almost to herself, before looking directly at Mr. Whitman. "Every waiver, every liability release, it's inconsistent with federal regulations. These minors' documents were manipulated, and yet the system signed off on them." I nodded, letting her words echo. My own silence was my strategy. I didn't need to confront my family just yet. The system would do it for me. And here, in this bright, sterile room, it would. The first wave of documents revealed what I already knew but hadn't dared confirm. My signature had been substituted on the voluntary separation form at 16. The airline system had flagged me as a released minor, absolving my guardians of responsibility. Every document that followed, every counseling note, every audit trail, confirmed the chain of legal protection that had left me alone, stranded, and quietly punished. I could see the subtle shifts in the room. My parents, seated stiffly at the far end, shifted in their chairs. Their lawyer attempted to interject, but Miss Ramirez's calm authority stopped him. She gestured toward the scanned emails linking my guardians to the submission of falsified waivers. "Each of these communications demonstrate intent to redirect liability," she said. "It's procedural negligence at best, deliberate evasion at worst." The micro-twists unfolded like clockwork. An old bank statement showed a sudden transfer of my minor trust funds weeks after my abandonment. Legal forms filed in their names, dated to the day after my 16th birthday, carried tiny inconsistencies, wrong initials, altered handwriting, and timestamps that contradicted their claims. Each discrepancy tightened the web, each paper a nail in the coffin of their legal facade. I kept my composure, just as I had at 16 when airport staff had escorted me away without explanation. The calm control I had cultivated over the years now amplified the impact of these discoveries. My parents' forced apologies were quiet, shaky, unconvincing. We were young too," my father muttered, his eyes darting toward the compliance officer. "It was a misunderstanding." Miss Ramirez didn't flinch. "If it was truly a misunderstanding," she said, voice neutral, "then why were liability waivers signed in your names weeks after the minor was flagged?" She let the silence settle over the table like a heavy curtain. The false supporter, an aunt who had once encouraged them to let me go, fidgeted, avoided eye contact, and eventually left without explanation. Her departure was quiet, procedural, just like the unraveling of their cover-up. I reviewed the corrected files. The minor abandonment status was formally rescinded, the trust funds restored, and liability reassigned. Every office stamp, signature, and digital acknowledgement was methodically logged. There was no victory speech, no dramatics. The system had worked. I had been patient, calculated, and observant, letting each micro-twist play out until the structure that had abandoned me crumbled under its own paperwork. A final review of the time-stamped emails revealed one last twist. A delayed internal audit, now marked complete, confirmed that every procedural misstep was documented, leaving the airline and my guardians accountable. My adult travel records were cleared, the fraudulent entries corrected. Quietly, efficiently, the correction was complete. I allowed myself a small breath of relief. My parents sat slumped, their defenses eroded by the relentless clarity of documents. The conference room, once sterile and oppressive, now felt like a stage where truth had quietly asserted itself. Miss Ramirez handed me a copy of the corrected minor status form, and I tucked it into my folder. No celebration, no gloating, just documentation, precision, and closure. I glanced out the glass walls at the terminal beyond, travelers moving obliviously. The world continued around us, indifferent, but I had secured my future and restored my identity without a single raised voice. The quiet collapse of my family's carefully constructed facade was complete. "You didn't scream," Miss Ramirez said softly, almost as an observation, "and yet you won." I nodded, letting the words linger. In the calm aftermath, the papers spoke louder than any apology could ever be. The airline's correction letters, the restored records, and the formal acknowledgement of wrongful abandonment, all of it was final. The system had delivered what human emotion had failed to. And in that moment, I realized that patience, preparation, and intelligence had won where confrontation never could. The false allies had vanished, the documents had spoken, and the truth was undeniable. The procedural victory was complete, leaving me with nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just freedom, integrity, and a restored future. I stood, picked up my folder, and walked out of the conference room. My parents' apologies faded behind me. Not because I ignored them, but because the system now bore witness to the truth. Every step forward felt lighter, calculated, and deliberate. No triumphal gestures, no shouting, only the quiet knowledge that justice had been served, measured, procedural, and complete. The airport lounge was quieter than usual, the hum of the ventilation blending with distant boarding calls. I held my corrected boarding pass in my hand, the small rectangle of paper heavier than any suitcase I'd ever carried. My coffee had cooled beside me, untouched, but it didn't matter. I wasn't in a rush. Not anymore. I could breathe again. The last 6 years of meticulous preparation, of tracing signatures, of confirming every digital timestamp and waiver, all had led to this exact calm moment. The airline records had been corrected. My minor abandonment status was permanently overturned. Liability had been reassigned to those responsible. Every fraudulent or substituted signature had been exposed through internal audits and quiet persistence, a chain of micro-twists I had orchestrated without ever raising my voice. I sipped the lukewarm coffee, my mind replaying the confrontation at the legal office. Mr. Whitman had been stunned when Miss Ramirez presented the evidence. My parents had tried their usual soft deflections. It was complicated. We thought we were doing the right thing. But their words carried no weight. The documents spoke for themselves. The forged voluntary separation form, the digital waiver misassignments, the emails, timestamps with their last-minute attempts to distance themselves from responsibility, every layer stacked against them silently but irrefutably. The system, which had once abandoned me, had become my instrument. My adult travel record was now correct, my identity restored, and the future I had fought for was finally mine. I looked around the lounge at the families rushing to flights, the business travelers tapping on laptops, the young kids tugging parents toward the gates. None of them knew what had been fought in quiet offices, through emails and scanned documents, in hearings that had been calm but relentless. None of them had seen how the subtle micro-twists of legal paperwork could topple a household's facade, how every signature, timestamp, and waiver could be leveraged with patience, intelligence, and precision. That was the power I had wielded, not through yelling, not through shouting, but through relentless adherence to facts, documents, and the system itself. That was the quiet revenge of logic over emotion, of procedure over personality, of truth over familial narrative. Even my so-called false supporter, my aunt who had encouraged my parents to let me go at 16, had disappeared. She had tried to argue once when Miss Ramirez presented the final corrected records, but without a shred of documentation to defend her own encouragement of my abandonment, she had slumped out of the room silently, the system rendering her irrelevant. I had won without confrontation, without emotion-driven drama, and it had been the most satisfying victory of all. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need recognition. What mattered was that the record was corrected and I could move forward. I allowed myself a small smile. Not smug, not celebratory, just a quiet acknowledgement of truth finally prevailing. I reflected on the chain of events, my minor flag in the airline system, temporary foster placements, lost documentation, forged signatures, the attempts to distance my parents from liability, the quiet compliance of authority allies who had eventually recognized the injustice. Every piece had fallen into place through careful, patient observation. Micro twists revealed the macro truth. The court of system logic had ruled in my favor, and I had merely been its silent advocate. And now, years later, at this airport, I finally felt the weight lift. No one needed to beg me to come back. No one had the right. The truth, properly documented and enforced, was my invitation. My boarding pass was not just a ticket to a flight, it was a symbol of autonomy restored, of childhood wrongs corrected, of emotional freedom claimed through intelligence and patience. I wasn't rich, I wasn't dramatic, but I was free. Every micro twist, every patient step, every quiet observation had led to this serene, undisturbed triumph. Systems had not failed me this time. They had worked in tandem with my strategy. I exhaled fully, finally, letting the years of anticipation, investigation, and meticulous planning dissolve into a calm sense of peace. And for the first time in a lifetime, I knew I was truly unburdened.